could maybe gather a little bit, since we don't have rain. It's nice to be able to. It's nice to be able to look at the people you're talking to, and so I really do appreciate that introduction, Chris, and I really appreciate the reboot of this Haymarket Festival here. And I think it's really important in the state of Illinois, as it is around the world, to have these May Day events. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to present 3 insurgent thoughts on work. And I had originally thought of presenting 5 insurgent thoughts on work, but each one takes about 5 minutes, so for 15 minutes, and now it turns out with the cancellation of the band I could have given you 5 insurgent thoughts, but I'm just going to give you 3 insurgent thoughts. So, May Day invites us to revisit and to rethink revolutionary traditions from the 19th century for the present and the future. The Haymarket Festival comes out of a trajectory from the Haymarket Massacre in Chicago in 1886, when police attacked workers making demands for an 8-hour workday. Now, at that time, the demand for an 8-hour workday was a total opposition to the capitalist workplace, where employers were quite well used to extracting as much as possible from their exhausted workforce. And the fact is that the beginnings of May Day were not about better wages and working conditions. The accompaniment in the front, little guy here, that's my son, Ramsey. He knows something about May Day, especially about disruption of business as usual. So the beginnings of May Day were not about better wages and working conditions. They were about an opposition to the whole system of life governed by profit. If you take a look at the history of May Day, also known as International Workers' Day, you will see that today, this day, comes to us from immigrants, anarchists, communists, socialists, and others disenchanted. In fact, the official commemoration of the day came out of an organization, the Second International Workingmen's Association, an organization of Karl Marx. And so with this spirit in mind, I now will present these 3 insurgent thoughts on work and life. And the first thought comes from a man named Paul Lafargue. Paul Lafargue. Paul Lafargue was Karl Marx's son-in-law. Lafargue married Karl's daughter Laura, and he did not like his father-in-law's fixation on the working class, because Lafargue felt, that we were better defined by what we did outside of work. You can imagine a family dinners. Actually, you'd want to get invited to that dinner, wouldn't you? But Lafargue thought that we were better defined not by what we did at work, but what we did outside of work. And that we should reconsider the so-called virtue of hard work, which today, of course, still remains a sacred virtue. Lafargue wrote a manifesto of his own called The Right to be Lazy. And he used to claim, Lafargue, that he was a Marxist. And once in a letter written by his father-in-law, Karl, he said, if he is a Marxist, then I am not a Marxist. But Lafargue considered the virtue of laziness. And as you know, today, laziness remains one of the most damning character traits, despite the fact that laziness is one of the most common and recurring of all human inclinations. And throughout history, liberals and conservatives have not appreciated the virtues of not working. Liberals and conservatives have been too quick to embrace the virtues of work and have variously spoken of the right to work as if the most fundamental right we have is to go to work for capitalists. Liberals often talk about jobs and full employment as if that were the solution to every problem. If only we could have jobs, if only we could work for the employing class, for the capitalist class. And conservatives, like Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, who defend the so-called right to work, renamed from what Lafarge meant. The right to work legislation that gives workers the so-called freedom not to pay union dues. Liberals and conservatives, though, agree that hard work is a virtue. Well, May Day. May Day is an opportunity to question the religion of work, to consider our lives outside of work, to consider the virtues of our lives not at work, the virtues of not working. A second insurgent thought. Following an idea from certainly a non-insurgent source, she would probably not agree with what I'm presenting here this afternoon. And that's American philosopher Martha Nussbaum. Nussbaum insists that play is a central human capability. She says, Nussbaum, that a good life is not possible without play. Now, I agree with that, but I would like to add that at its very best, play is an antidote to work. There is a name for play when you play at work. When you play at work, the name is called insubordination. And because of the virtue of hard work, which I mentioned in the first one, coupled with the vilification of play, we have come to think of insubordination as a bad thing. Because the employing class, the employers, call it a bad thing. They call insubordination a bad thing. But what is the opposite of insubordination? The opposite of insubordination is subordination. We ought to ask ourselves if we want to accept subordination as a virtue. Now, young children, they know the difference and the distance between work and play. They express a general preference, too, if you haven't noticed. One of my sons right there, sitting on the edge of the stage. He knows the difference between work and play, and he's 8 years old. And he does have a preference, as his teachers will tell you. For adults, play is often eventually abolished or reserved for smartphone distractions at the end of an exhausted day. Many adults, and I would count myself among these, only reconnect with play when they're spending lots of time with children. But one thing to notice about play, which I notice when I play with my two sons, play is an activity outside of work, and it follows an entirely different logic than the capitalist logic, the profit logic that governs our lives at work, which is most of our wakeful state, most of our time alive. Play is not governed by a profit logic, it's governed by other things: imagination, free time, open space. For many young people, the very first direct experience of a little bit of liberation is the end of the school day. Now, which candidate in these two capitalist parties, these big parties in this country, which one for the presidency speaks about the critical importance of play, not to mention the common virtue of laziness? Who says that? Who stands up and talks about the virtue of laziness and the critical importance of play? On May Day, we might consider the importance of play and how work seeks to abolish it. Now a third insurgent idea. A third insurgent idea. So if you're counting, the first is laziness. The second is play. These ideas are insurgent ideas. They can subvert everything, almost everything, laziness and play. But we have to think about that. We have to be creative about that. But a third insurgent idea from the feminist philosopher, Silvia Federici. In the 1970s, Silvia Federici participated in a movement called Wages for Housework. Wages for Housework highlighted how so much of what is called women's work is not treated as eligible for wage labor. And is even expected, women's work, expected to be unpaid. I mean, isn't it a peculiar thing that my partner would say, when she's asked, what do you do? What is your job? She might say, right now I'm not working. She's working harder than me. She's working harder than me, much harder than me. But money does not know how to value what she does. But before you demand to know who should or could pay for housework and for child rearing, let me clarify Silvia Federici's main point. She opposes the capitalist wage system. So winning wages for housework was never her position. She's not saying pay us wages for housework. She's not saying let's solve the problem, let's find a way to pay women for so-called women's work, because if you could win wages for housework, that would just show the virtues of the very wage system she seeks to condemn. You could say, look what we can do. You wanted wages for housework, and now we give you wages for housework. So how bad can it be? Federici's point is much better made by the impossibility of sustainably paying wages for housework in the current system of work and life. She wants, through wages with housework, to reveal a fundamental flaw. A fundamental flaw in capitalism. Capitalism which is incapable of valuing what people value the most. Ask people, what are the most central values? A simple question here about the most important functions of any society reliably returns the well-being of children as one of the most fundamental commitments. It's a commitment with near universal, cross-cultural, global resonance. And yet, capitalism shows what it values with money. And it's incapable of paying wages for housework because it's incapable of valuing the most basic human values that all of us recognize. Even in the case where families outsource child care to professionals, that labor is overwhelmingly done by women working low-paid, exhausting, and precarious jobs. Now, meanwhile, take a look at the pathetic state of wage politics in the United States today. It is considered radical today to demand $15 an hour for a minimum wage. That's the radical demand, $15 minimum wage. Hillary Clinton wants to start at 12. Bernie, well, he's so dangerous. Bernie, you know how dangerous he is. That dangerous man wants to go straight to 15. Hillary, he says, you can start at 12, I'll start at 15. Look at this radical demand, okay. Until you stop to think that $15 an hour at 35 hours a week comes to about $25,000 a year before taxes. That's a full-time job. $15 minimum wage comes to about $25,000 a year before taxes. So that is the dilapidated state of wage politics today. The radical position, even taken up by so many so-called socialists whose basic political position is that of mainstream liberals in 1930. Their radical position of these socialists is to demand what would be a living wage in the 1950s for a family of two. $15 an hour is less than half of what would be a reasonable demand for a living wage in almost any city in the U.S. today. Now, you're going to say, well, he doesn't want $15 an hour minimum wage. Yeah, sure, we should get $15 minimum wage. Of course we should fight for that. And I'm in solidarity with those who stand up and fight for $15 minimum wage. But I make this point to highlight the fact that reason is simply too radical for our irrational capitalist reality. Reason is too radical for our capitalist reality because reason says it's unreasonable to ask for more than a living wage in 1950. And anybody who does is unreasonable. The ones who only want $25,000 a year, those are barely reasonable people on the fringes of society. Well, May Day is indeed also a fine time to point that out. And at what point really do we realize that the solutions on offer are always simultaneously the same basic problems? At what point do we realize that the demand for what would be a living wage in 1950 is also a solution that is a problem? Without a total transformation of the whole arrangement of work and life, the solutions will always also be the problems. And right now, during the generalized insanity of an election cycle where regular people you know with common sense all of a sudden hyper-identify with a person in a party and everything that they know is wrong with that person in that party, they suspend any possible ability to recognize what's wrong with that person or party. This hyper-identification is definitely, and this is not my area to be equipped, I'm not trained to tell you this, but I do believe it certainly is a form of pathology. This is a pathological identification that is immediately shed after the generalized insanity of the election cycle that is behind us. Not immediately sometimes, but this is the nature of the condition. But it's especially important to point out now during this election cycle that we simply cannot vote for the total transformation that we so urgently need. We cannot vote for the total transformation we so urgently need. Now, drawing to a close here. Of course, May Day is a good day to point out that we cannot vote for the transformations we need. But today is Sunday, and you are not at work. Chris is probably working a little bit. And you are also not alone. All over the world. All over the world, far more outside of the state in which May Day commemorates, state of Illinois, all around this world today, people are not at work there in the streets. Take a look at what's going on in France. The up all night is in intensification. And there are people who know that what we need is a total transformation that we cannot vote for through the ballots. Total transformation, I've said a few times, sometimes that is called a revolution. Now, you might ask, and I think you should demand to know, what is practical in these three insurgent thoughts? What is practical here? What is practical in thinking about these things? Well, if what is practical is what can be implemented in the present situation, then I don't want to speak about what is practical. If what is practical is to consider only what can be done within the limits of a world we reject, in the limits of a system we condemn as immoral and unacceptable, then I would prefer to speak of the possible and the desirable. The possible and the desirable can be contrasted with what is called practical, and the possible and the desirable is also practical, something that is easier to see when we start doing it. What is possible and desirable is practical. It's just harder to see until we are doing it. And think about a demand for the practical recommendation of a talk here tonight, today on May Day. You know what's declared impractical. First of all, a living wage is called impractical. So, I mean, you want to demand what's practical, then you should do it. You should start off at $12 an hour, because you know Hillary Clinton says $12 an hour is practical. That's practical. Thanks, guys. A moment for applause is in another minute. So, what is called practical today is exactly a politics that needs to be questioned and rejected. We should be thinking always about the possible and the desirable as opposed to the practical. Today's practicality answers nothing. So once again, tomorrow is the question. Thank you. Happy May Day, solidarity. Hope to see you soon. Thanks. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.